what we fail to recognize is that beauty actually is an essential link between truth and goodness. Without beauty, truth doesn't actually do anything to affect us. And actually, if we're not giving due consideration to beauty, and if we're not giving consideration to how we're communicating truth, we actually might be working against the truth.
Well, hello and welcome to Musically Speaking. I'm Jared Ritchie. Thanks for listening on today's episode, which promises to be, I hope, very encouraging, very insightful, and very packed of the topics around beauty, aesthetics, and particularly the Redeemer School of the Arts. Today's guest is a dear friend of mine, Dr. Scott Aniol, who is the president of G3 Ministries in Douglasville, Georgia. He is also on the faculty at Grace Bible Theological Seminary in Conway, Arkansas. And more towards today's discussion, he is both a board member and a faculty member for the Redeemer School of the Arts here in Northeast Louisiana, a 1- and 2-year program which has a very unique model in training the arts, and we hope to talk about that. You'll hear some of that discussion today. So without any further ado, here is that wonderful discussion I had recently with Dr. Scott Aniol. Hope you enjoy. I thought we would just talk a little, Scott, about some of these issues. For someone listening who's curious in the arts, there seems to be a resurgence in discussion in academia and Christian academia, I guess you could say, about the arts. It's kind of a buzzword.
Yeah.
What would you kind of, to prime the pump of this discussion, of what do you see in your work in aesthetics? Someone who's listening on this podcast has seen your face on here and heard you, and I've quoted you and probably accidentally plagiarized you from time to time. What would you, just as an opening salvo, talk about the arts and why something like what we're doing at RSA is valuable, and then let's see where it takes us discussion-wise.
Well, I think, we Christians, especially conservative, Orthodox, evangelical Christians, we place a high emphasis on truth. God's word is truth, doctrine matters, amen, we emphasize that. And then we also emphasize how we live, the morality of our lives, that we need to live according to God's law, that we need to live in ways that are consistent with our beliefs, we need to live in ways that please God. Great. But, for many, many years now, this whole area of beauty, of aesthetics, has been relativized, has been regarded as, extracurricular. It's something that, if you like music, if you like beauty, if you happen to like art, then, okay, that's for you, but it's not necessary. And what we failed to recognize is that beauty actually is an essential link between truth and goodness. Without beauty, truth doesn't actually do anything to affect us. And actually, if we're not giving due consideration to beauty, aesthetics is always there. And if we're not giving consideration to how we're communicating truth, we actually might be working against the truth. Because even, we use that word aesthetics, and, that word comes from a Greek word, aisthenomai, which means I perceive. So aesthetics really has to do with perception of truth. Either the way that somebody perceives the truth or the way in which we communicate truth, which affects perception. So again, that is always there. If you're a teacher, if you're a preacher, the way in which you communicate truth, that's aesthetics. And then you extend that on to the way you carry yourself, what you're wearing, the room in which you're speaking. All of these things contribute to the way that the truth is perceived. So if we don't give consideration to beauty, if we don't give consideration to aesthetics, then it is quite possible we might have all the intention in the world to communicate truth and affect people's lives to live according to God's law. But if the way that we communicate that, if our aesthetics is actually contrary to the truth, then we're actually working against the truth. So that's why aesthetics matters.
Right.
And if we're talking about no matter what we're talking about, communicating truth visually, communicating truth audibly, communicating truth even, this is not just about worship. This is about life and what we do in our homes and when we have families over for meals, and all of that is influencing our lives and influencing the way that we perceive God and His truth and the way that we live it out. All of that is aesthetics. We can't get away from it. It's important because you can't get away from it.
I think we can get away from it.
Yeah.
And I think the Christian church has, I can hear the objection. Someone's like, oh, yeah, you can be hollow and be so worried about the optics of something and not the truth and or the substance of it. But I don't know that we're in danger of that today. I think it seems like we've got a lot of things what you're calling for, what I'm calling for, is a balanced view, a corrective view where aesthetics is given. And also it's given a due focus, but also we're made in the image of God, right? He's a creator and we're lesser little creators.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the ways we image. He creates and so do we. And creates to bless and to serve and to echo His goodness, right?
Right. Yeah, but that's also why I think it's helpful to understand aesthetics as that through which we see, right? Beauty is that through which we see. So it's not it's not for its own sake in that sense. That's where we can get off balance, right? If we, if we just value beautiful things and art and music for its own sake, merely, then that becomes problematic. But if we recognize this is how we come to know God, this is how we come to know God's world, this is how we communicate to others our interpretation of God and His world. And again, this is more than just worship, right? You can write a song about love and life, and you are communicating your interpretation of God's world to people. You can write a purely abstract piece of music, no lyrics, no program, or an abstract work of art. You're still communicating something of your interpretation of God's world to people. That matters. So if you view it that way, then it's you can't overemphasize it because you're seeing it as in, like you said, in service to God, in service to others. And as men and women created in God's image, God has gifted us with this ability to do that, to take the stuff of His world and to reorganize it in order to communicate an interpretation of the world. And that's important. We need to recognize that all art is interpretive. It's interpreting something of God and His world, and therefore it can be either true or false, or more or less true or more or less false. And so again, that's why it matters. And it's you can't just dismiss it, like you said. We think we can dismiss it, but you can't.
Right. It's interesting to me. Someone wants to study art and aesthetics, and there's a lot of these things that kind of have to hold in tension, can't get out of balance. You mentioned about perceiving. A lot of times I've discussed these things with folks, and they talk about subjective view of art and objective view of art.
Yeah.
And Aquinas had some helpful in his Summa talking about both. I find that maybe you could talk a little bit about some of his two ways to get at those definitions. But before you do that, I've thought they must kind of hold in tension. There must not be slack in the line, right? We need a subjective view of beauty and art. We also need to work from an objective way as well. You don't want to swing the pendulum in either direction too far. I think in the modern world, everybody's like objective, because we live in subjective run amok.
Right.
What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is how we define our terms too. I mean, it's always going to be subjective because we have subjects involved, and even defining it as perception. By definition, then we're talking about subjects who are perceiving things through a work of art or through a medium of communication. So that's what we mean by subjective. And and in that sense, there really is no such thing as true objectivity. You're always going to be influenced by something, presuppositions, how things are affecting you, your culture, right? So
your sin nature.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you can perceive something wrongly or rightly.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you're right. You are perceiving that. That's what Aquinas said, right? Is things that please upon being perceived.
Right, and that's the question. With his definition of beauty is that which pleases when it is apprehended or perceived. The question is, does it please because it is beautiful, or is it beautiful because it pleases?
Hmm.
Right. That's where, yes, it is. So it is subjective because it has to do with our taking pleasure in or being influenced by how something is communicated, our perception being influenced. So it's subjective in that sense because I'm a subject.
Mhm.
But that's not what makes it beautiful. What makes it beautiful, as with truth and goodness, is God, right? God is capital T truth. God is capital G goodness, and God is capital B beauty.
Mm.
There is an absolute standard. So that's how I like to articulate it. It's not necessarily even objective versus subjective. It is subjective because we've got subjects involved, but there is an absolute standard of what is true and good and beautiful. And I like to, I talk about this a little bit in Worship and Song, which is my most recent revised and expanded edition of my first book. But I did a little book called Sound Worship, and I talk about this, how, with relation to beauty. It's also the case with truth and goodness that there is an objective sense and a subjective sense, right? There is always an absolute standard of truth and goodness and beauty. But I'm a subject and I'm always involved. So the subjective side of truth is what I believe, right? So it's subjective. But by saying it's subjective doesn't mean that I'm always right, because like you said earlier, my sin nature, my fallibility, I can get things wrong, right? So just because it's subjective does not mean it's relative. So that's, the opposites really are absolute and relative. Beauty is not relative. It is subjective because subjects are involved, but there's absolute standard. It's not relative. So that's the case with truth, with morality. What is morality? Is there an absolute standard? Of course there is. It's God. But then there is what I think is good for me or what I prefer. That's the subjective side, and I could be right or I could be wrong. So we I think we all recognize that when it comes to morality and even truth. But the same is true with beauty. It is subjective. I like certain things. I dislike certain things. I take pleasure in certain things. I don't take pleasure in other things. But just because it's subjective doesn't mean it's relative. There still is an absolute standard. And so we have to hold all of those things. And I mean, it gets more complicated too, because we do have personal experiences, cultural things that happen that add other layers above the art, on top of the art. And usually that's kind of what people emphasize when they're trying to argue all this is all relative, because look at all this culture thinks one thing and this culture thinks another thing. Well, yeah, cultures do approach things differently, which again, though, doesn't necessarily mean everybody's right.
Yeah, not all cultures are egalitarian and equal.
Exactly.
That are equally mature, equally developed, equally faithful, careful.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you have to weigh that, but then also, I mean, there are cases in which two cultures might approach something differently, and in that particular case, either way is good and fine. It's just different.
Right.
There is that exists. But that doesn't mean it's relative. It just, it just allows for the added layers of cultural meaning above the inherent absolute meaning of, whatever we're talking about. So I think we need to emphasize both. Both are the case. Both are always a reality. Yeah. There is absolute, there are objectives, there is universal, transcendent truth, goodness, and beauty. If you recognize that, then yes, there are other layers that you can lay on top of that,
sure.
But without denying the absolute.
Yeah, it seems like you're going to be shocked that I'm going here with this part of the discussion, but it seems like you can't really ever dig down in very deep into much maturity in these areas if you don't have a common vernacular language in talking about these things. I mean, in our medium of music, you can't. If you don't understand the language, your assessment and value of what it does is very, very shallow. It's very, very, how does it strike you in immediacy, right? You don't have the ability to interact with, is this really good? Because you don't know what makes good. You don't know the components of good.
Yeah, I would say, people who don't know the language and don't understand what's going on, it does affect them. but they don't have the tools necessary to rightly assess it.
Hmm.
And that's, I mean, in our social media world, our internet world, where everybody's an expert on everything.
Yeah, hot take.
Yeah, exactly. People think that that their judgment of a thing is just as good as another, which is certainly not the case. But the reason I emphasize, that it does affect people is because the flip side is some people will say, well, I don't understand music, so it doesn't really affect me. It doesn't matter. Well, it is affecting you. Art is affecting you. Again, aesthetics, the way that ideas and truth are interpreted and presented is influencing you, even if you don't understand why or how. But that's just all the more reason to learn why and how.
Right. You don't always know everything you eat and what its
Right.
chemical makeup is. You eat it. You don't understand how it
Yeah.
affects your digestion and
Right.
all of that, your cortisol levels.
Or the other illustration I like to use is like with facial expressions and body language. Like you can discern what's going on like inside somebody by how they comport themselves, by their body language and their facial expressions. You probably can't explain physiologically why
Right.
it's doing that, but because of just common human experience that it is. And art works a lot that way too, on one level, in that I like to describe it as communicating on the level of the culture of humanity. Because it really is tied to physiology. And so it is communicating, it is influencing us, even if we can't quite articulate it. But don't pretend that you can assess it, that you can make judgments about it until you actually understand it and you have the language to do it.
Right. So we've kind of pulled the threads on just some of the thinking behind this discussion and maybe primed the pump even to keep mixing in metaphors, which I'm prone to do. But here we are, enter the Redeemer School of the Arts.
Yeah.
And those listening, I came to you several years ago and said, Scott, we want to train people in the arts, definitely in music and maybe in some other disciplines, culinary, visual, and that kind of thing, to think rightly and to not do so Gnostically, to not do so as if art is just an understanding, but it doesn't form you.
Mhm.
And so we thought worship and the right ordering of loves and ordering of our lives, and to borrow from Schaeffer, your life is art. So we've built this curriculum out, and done so in a 1 and 2 year kind of an art certificate program where students can come and find a little bit of a proving ground in music and culinary, all from within this lens that art is not extracurricular
Right.
in the full orbed understanding of what we're called to be image bearers. Would talk a little bit about why we need these kinds of programs, why you're willing to teach, psalm classes, music history, be on the board with us and kind of roll the sleeves up in this project.
Yeah. Well, you alluded to this a few minutes ago that, not all cultures are created equal. Not all art is created equal, because culture and art is an expression of and an embodiment of beliefs, values, ideas. And in the West, because of the strong dominant influence of Christianity for so long, the dominance of the church for so long, that seeped into all of Western culture, and the great composers, the great poets, the great artists were standing on the rock solid foundation of those things to produce the wonderful works of arts that we have in our tradition, right? Well, we've lost a lot of that.
Right.
And once the church was dethroned by Enlightenment rationalism and the scientific method, and then Darwin and evolution, we've got competing values now that are more dominant, and where we could take in Western culture, we could take a lot for granted for many years, because culture, I say this to the students all the time in my classes, culture doesn't change overnight. I mean, we're still experiencing some of the benefits and echoes of hundreds of years of dominant influence of Christian values and biblical beliefs.
We're spending the inheritance.
Exactly, yeah. But the church and Christianity explicitly is no longer taking ownership of the arts like it once did, because again, we took things for granted for so long.
Right.
So I think we're at the place where, I mean, you look at the arts world today, whether it be music or visual arts or whatever, and I mean, yeah, there are still some pockets where they're performing older things, and you have a rare composer now and then who might, compose something that's beautiful and also new, but even then, there's not a whole lot of cultivation really. And it's because, Quentin Faulkner in his book Wiser Than Despair, he says what happened after the Enlightenment is that you have music now as a theological orphan.
Mm.
And so it's taken a while because again, they're operating on borrowed time, borrowed capital. But I think we're finally, and we have been for a while, but I think many of us are now really emphasizing the problem with this. There is no new art being produced anymore, and there's no cultivation. There's no Bach's out there, doing the amazing things that he did. So that means that churches need to reclaim this.
Right.
We can't take it for granted anymore. The culture is becoming more and more secularized. There's so many competing values now, and so we need to bring it back to the culture of the church. We need to cultivate our own culture and begin to bring up musicians, bring up artists, bring up young people, and immerse them in the tradition and in the theology and in the philosophy, so that maybe then their children or grandchildren will start being Bachs again.
Right. Yeah. It seems like some people might think that the greatness of a Bach was incidental to the Reformation, and I think you and I would argue it was because of the Reformation.
Yeah.
There would be no Bach without Luther.
Right.
And it seems like the Redeemer School of the Arts and getting that orientation right, maybe you can talk some about that, where it's not just let's throw a Bible class in or let's have a class on the Psalms and worship.
Right.
How does that orient and kind of get at what you're saying about not being an orphaned music or orphaned visual arts or
right.
culinary?
Well, I think it's instructive, that Bach wrote Soli Deo Gloria, SDG, on his sacred compositions and on those things he wrote that were not explicitly, for the church or to be performed in the liturgy.
Right.
Because he recognized a holistic view, and it ties into our whole understanding of the arts as that which influences perception. So it's not just about the liturgy. Yes, I mean, I'm a big advocate of our worship having beauty because it's important, but we need it in all of life, and you only can come to grasp that as a Christian who recognizes that nothing that I do is separated from my faith in Jesus Christ, my desire to live in obedience to his law and in a way that glorifies him. So that has to happen within a more holistic atmosphere, within the church, within a biblical understanding. You can't just say, well, let's teach Bible doctrine over here, and then let's have a music class or an arts class over here that's completely divorced from that. It doesn't work that way because, again, culture and art is an embodiment of what we believe and what we value. So it's that more integrated, holistic approach that, again, in Western culture just happened naturally because it was in the fabric of culture. We don't have that anymore, so we have to be more intentional about it. And the way to do that is to do it, do it intentionally in the context of the community of faith.
That's right. When you were talking about, you and I talking about this, program here and how we could flesh it out and set classes for students and what kind of students would show up at the Redeemer School of the Art, and would they be, wanting to go here versus go to a conservatory of music.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people would send their kids to, Behemoth College or Leviathan State University. Here we are in Louisiana, LSU, right? But they wouldn't appreciate me saying that. But, and they would say that's just what you've always done. You have a PhD. You taught PhDs. You helped us build this program out. Somebody's considering doing a program like this. What kind of advice would you give them in studying the arts and giving them permission to do that in a world where you chase the degree, you chase the 4-year, the 2-year degree, and often it chases you somewhere you didn't intend for it to. Our children, maybe, especially if it's secular universities, but even Christian universities, not being too closely tethered just because you can go study at a Christian university and not be in a good church.
Yeah.
But what would you've dealt with this, you've thought deeply on this. People are out there wanting to try something new. How do you embolden them to do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you go out to some conservatory, you might get fantastic musical, technical instruction. But you're going to fall into that trap we talked about earlier of seeing that as an end in itself and not as a servant to the church, a servant to God's people, or again, like I said earlier, that which helps, glorifies God by communicating His truth and His goodness in ways consistent with His character. You're not going to recognize that. You're going to be taught by instructors who don't have any conception of that. So you're not going to grasp the whole purpose of the thing, right? Whereas if you come to a place where everything is integrated with a biblical understanding of the purpose of life, of a life of worship, of a life lived in community with God's people, in covenant with Him and in covenant with His people, you're recognizing that the arts are meant by God to be in service of His own glory and of His people, and that's embodied in the very way that you're being taught. So, you can get good technical instruction somewhere else, but you're not going to get that integrated. And then even in like a Christian university or something that happens to have a couple music degrees or whatever, well, there's still probably not that holistic integration. I mean, that's part of the problem with a lot of even modern Christian education. It's just very fragmented, very siloed. So that I'm just a big advocate of seeing, I'm teaching courses on music history, but I'm emphasizing the whole purpose of these classes is to understand how culture and theology and worship, and philosophy, how they all work together. And I don't think you can be an artist to the fullest, glorifying God, serving the church, serving His people, until you really come to grasp all of that. And you're not going to get that in a place that doesn't have that kind of holistic integration of all these disciplines and ideas.
Right. Then there seems to be there's community is lacking in a lot of art making, both in not just in the critique of it, but in the motivation and the spurring one another on to encourage, to, whether it's food or song, or you might get that if you stumble into it at a good university. It has a good program.
Most arts programs are the opposite. There's so much competition. You're in it for yourself,
cutthroat,
and that. I mean, again, that's approaching the arts in a completely opposite way that God designed them to be, as a servant, right? So by studying in community and within the context of a church, and with these sorts of emphases stressed, then you're actually recognizing God's purpose for the arts and living them out to the fullest.
Yeah. So you're here in one of your on-site intensive teaching, but the students are in residence, which kind of flips the model.
Yeah.
A lot of colleges, the faculty's at the brick and mortar institution,
right,
and the students can be behind a Zoom screen. We've kind of flipped that around with this whole community idea in mind, just so that the students are not left to be kind of just a face on a Zoom quadrant, but the faculty, we want them here. Some of them are here. You're obviously in Georgia. But we really see that's just not been done. It's not been done as much, unless I'm mistaken. Have you?
No, I think you're right. I think it's a unique model. And I see this, when I'm interacting with students, even over Zoom, I'm at a distance, but they're all in the same room. And, you can tell that there's relationships being developed, that there's community, that they're encouraging one another. And I intentionally build, things into the courses to help that. And you can do some of that when the students are scattered, but it's so hard. I've done that for many years.
Sure.
It's far easier when they're living life together, they're eating together, they're worshiping together, they're in homes together. They're able to have conversations about the things that are being discussed. They're able to perform for one another and make food for each other. All of that you can't do when they're scattered. So I think it's a unique model. I'm not familiar with this really being done anywhere quite like this, and I think it's really a brilliant way of enabling some real experts who happen to not live here to be a part of it, but to benefit from the community of a residential program.
Yeah. So if someone wants to come and study with us at RSA, wants to take music or culinary or visual art, what would you have them be doing now, or what would you tell their parents if they're on the fence of not knowing what to do, maybe to reassure them, considering these things? It seems like we're in new times. It seems like we're kind of a page turning of. There's always talk of higher ed bubbles and what do you do with your kids? It's almost like everybody's got to go to do this and do that, and sometimes it takes somebody to be encouraged to try something that's a little outside the box. What would you say to that parent or student?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, there's so many families who are now just saying, I just want my kids to stay home and go to community college. I don't want to send them off somewhere. And you understand why. If you send them off some secular university or even some Christian, school, you don't know what church they're in. You don't know, what's going on.
Or if they're in church at all.
Oh, they're in the church at all, yeah. The beauty of the model here is they're in sort of a protected environment within the church. They're being looked out for by families in the congregation, even living with families who are in the congregation.
That's right.
So they're entering into an already vibrant, established Christian community, and then getting the benefits of a residential program that you don't get if you're just doing a distance program, and you certainly don't get by sending them off to even locally to some community college. They're not going to get the same.
Right.
So to me, it's like the best of all the worlds. You're getting the benefits of a residential program. You're not, as a parent, I've got one in college, you're not worrying about what's influencing them. Is there the body life that is so necessary to spiritual vitality? That's here. And so you can trust that, you can rest in that, and have them receive real quality residential education in which they're influencing one another in community. So there's really all the strengths kind of mixed together. Plus, great faculty, some of which are here, and like you mentioned, some of which are not. But they're getting all of that, in one package.
Yeah, and just hitting back what you said on that, not all cultural traditions, not all, we study the Western tradition, but only study the Western tradition not because of its geography, but because of the gospel's interaction and seeping into it. And I think that seems to be the pattern that we've got to get worship right before we can get arts and the good life.
Right.
And it seems like, we're both of us deep into the Bible Belt. Obviously, you're born and raised in Michigan, but everybody's a Christian in the Bible Belt, right? And everybody is believes in Jesus, but it's this right loves and right practice. And it seems like the arts are a lot of the ways in which we can testify when the world has heard all the tracts on the street corner. They've heard the plan of salvation. They need to be brought, and our people need to be equipped for that.
Yeah.
Technical colleges seem to be, kind of an answer to the higher ed bubble, just giving people practical training. But what about to that parent, educating their kids, and maybe in something where you come away like we're doing, a art certificate program, and kind of a training ground. The parent doesn't know that the daughter or the son doesn't know what they want to do, if they want to be a career musician or a chef.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe just talk about what do you see as the kind of the proving ground of that, and also the theology of it, the feasting and the worship integration.
Well, I think we need to. The other thing we need to recover in sort of a post-Enlightenment, even Christianity, is the purpose of education. It's not just vocational training. I mean, yes, there is that element. We got to make a living and do it to the glory of God, and there's value in work. But education is so much more than that. Education is formation, it's discipleship, it's shaping. Education is shaping of a person, not just impartation of a skill set. And so that's the value of even coming for 1 year, coming for 2 years, and then maybe deciding, even if somebody comes for 2 years and decides, I don't want a career in music, I want to go do law. They've still been shaped and formed. Their character has been developed. Their loves have been cultivated. And then especially, again, because it's here in the church and there's a community, that's all influenced them, in ways that are, almost inexpressible, the value of it. Again, we're shaping people and cultivating people and discipling people. We need to recover that vision of education. And so we're not only asking what paycheck, what career path is this going to equip, my son or my daughter for? No, what kind of person is this education going to produce? And then, this is the value. And this is, you hear stories about this now, even as, Christian classical education has grown for so many years, where the emphasis is very similar. It's not about career training, it's about people educating. Well, it just so turns out, happens to turn out that somebody who has been cultivated with biblical virtues and values and has been discipled and has matured through the fiery furnace of, these courses and everything, happens to get into good graduate programs and happens to get good jobs, not because they gain some sort of ABC skill set, but because they've been formed into people who can succeed in life,
and a lot of skills,
and a lot of skills along the way, right? So I think that's what that's the value. You can come here for 2 years, and then decide, this is for me, and then now, having been matured 2 more years, been rooted in the scriptures, rooted in biblical values, with a better, deeper understanding of the nature of the world and God's word and the way things have developed in culture. Now go out and get more education, maybe, or a career in the arts. Or you come through this and you decide that then the arts are not for me, and you've still benefited from all that has been cultivated in you as a student through the program. So it's not wasted. It's not a wasted thing. You go to a trade school, get through the whole program with a skill set, and decide that's not for me. That's kind of wasted,
right?
But if you've gone through a program in which you are discipled and matured, and your knowledge and your loves have been cultivated, then even if you don't go into the arts as a career, you've come out a better Christian.
Isn't that similarly the case if you go and you have a general studies degree at a college, maybe a secular college, and you don't do that, or an English degree, maybe that would help you, or maybe you did political science and you don't work in anything, but you're, driving.
Yeah, but I read some statistic once recently, like 70% of college grads are not even working in the field of the degree that they were in, something like that. So if you went to an institution where you were shaped and cultivated and then you gained a skill set too, and you happen to now be in a career that's different, okay, no problem, because you benefited from virtue cultivation. But if you went somewhere where all you did was gain a set of skills, then you wasted a lot of money.
That's right. Apprenticeship, it seems to be something else that we're trying to put into, maybe another way of saying what you're here at the Redeemer School of the Arts, where you're in community, sure, with other students, of course, and with the church. So you're not it's kind of built into the DNA, it's built into the model, but also you're kind of alongside of people and the way to serve. You mentioned the Enlightenment. It seems to me the arts, of all the ways the Enlightenment has shaped the way we think of the arts, not least of which is the view of the arts to serve versus celebrity.
Yeah.
And the way you do that is you have to see studying together. You have to learn from someone else. You have to actually submit, put yourself under the mission of somebody else there. And it seems like we need more of that. So I'm so thankful for you to help us out. And if folks are interested, they can, check out the Redeemer School of the Arts, rsala.org. There's preview weekends where you can come on site and see and do. So we'd love to have folks in music and culinary and visual art as the concentrations in 1 and 2 year focus areas there. Lastly, Scott, I guess just to put just an interesting outro on this, AI. AI and in relation to the arts or humanizing is the leaning in more heavily into the creative arts, into these common liberal arts. Is this the way that we can be equipped and right-oriented to use the tools of AI more properly? Should we be all the more? Would that be a case for the Redeemer School of the Arts? Is because the prevalence of AI and to make sure we are grounded in more human ways of feasting and singing and worship?
Yeah,
Would you speak to that?
AI to be sure, but I mean also just the social media world in which we live in which I see this all the time, on X, where it seems like people have it looks like it, but it's not real. Stronger virtual relationships than they have actual relationships with flesh and blood. So you've got social media, you've got the Zoom world in which we live, which has only been exacerbated by post-COVID. And then now AI, which is adding a whole nother layer of sort of depersonalized relationships, all the more reason to get back to education that's actually flesh and blood, sitting across the table from a real human being, eating together, singing together, actually experiencing life together. It's just not only is that good in and of itself, it's also an antidote to the sort of personalized relational world in which we live.
Yeah, that's great. What books would you recommend to folks? I would throw in them Art and the Bible by Francis Schaeffer. Do you have any recommendations? Somebody wants just to meditate a little bit more deeply on these things?
Art and Music, a Student Guide by Munson and Drake is great. And then I referenced earlier, it's a little more difficult reading, but it's really a foundational book, Wiser Than Despair by Quentin Faulkner. Really helps in explaining the relationship between music and the church, and why we got a Bach, and then why we don't have Bachs today.
Wow.
And it's really a very powerful book.
Well, thanks so much, Scott. Appreciate it. And you can find out more about the Redeemer School of the Arts at rsala.org. Thanks for listening. Until next time, take care.